Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, the author of Going Home to Glory, David Eisenhower.
David Eisenhower, how old were you when you realized that your grandfather was not an ordinary grandpa?
I think it's my first memory of the world. I can actually remember some scenes from the summer of 1951. I was 3 years old. This was a summer that my mother, father, my sister Ann, Susan, and myself spent in Paris with Ike and Mamie. At the time, Granddad was Supreme Commander of the NATO forces, the NATO alliance that just formed. I can remember sitting in an airplane and watching him board in a military uniform. And even then, I had a sense of, two worlds. One is a quiet world where I'm sort of on my own. And the second is a world around Dwight Eisenhower, which is full of aides and people arriving with messages and everybody dressed up and so forth. So I was aware very early. I can't literally cannot remember a time where I did not think that Dwight Eisenhower was somebody pretty special.
No, you were born when?
I was born in 1948.
So you would have been 4 when he became president.
I was 3, and I remember a number of things from that summer. I can remember we lived in a hotel for a little while called the Petit Trianon, which was right on the border of Versailles. And there was a gardener, and the children were taken out for pony rides. I can remember the pony rides vaguely. I remember the flight home with my grandparents and Mamie, who hated to fly, being attended by all these nurses and things like this. I can remember when he was elected in 1952, and then I can remember the first time I saw the White House, which was June of 1953. I remember that very well. I can remember being shown around the 3rd floor of the White House and saying, "This is where you can set up your airplanes. This is where you can."
What's it like being a kid in the White House?
Well, it was a Disneyland, if you can imagine this, for a young child. And in the era, the 1950s were a stable era in this country, and so people were in a good mood, and they didn't mind children driving tricycles through the ground floor. And so if you can imagine this 105-room mansion, you have sort of a run on it because nobody knows how to say no to you. All of the butlers on duty, every meal was fabulous. A movie theater, a swimming pool, a great big south lawn where you can have your friends over and become the most popular person in school. It was really, it was a lot of fun when I was a child. I think we looked at it differently when we went back in 1969 and 1970. Different era, and the house remained an inspiring place, fun place to be. But the whole ambiance of the White House was different.
Were there times when you toddled in on high-level meetings and everyone
yes.
put
In
up
fact, in this book that we've just published, Going Home to Glory, I allude to a day when I was anxious to make a copy of the first short story I'd ever written. I had an ambition as a child to be a short story writer. And I finally produced one. It was about my cousin Janet, who had come east from Chicago in the summer of 1957. And I wrote about a 10-page, I always went for 10 pages, handwritten. And according to the records kept by Ancy Whitman, who was the president's secretary, July 15th, David, me, age 10, I wander into her office with this story, and I asked her to type it up. This is the president's secretary. She produced a copy of it, and we ran off about 10 or so, and I put this thing on sale in the hallway right outside the Oval Office in the President's Secretary's office, and it was a good day to have your first short story on sale there because Marines were landing in Lebanon that morning. So the cabinet is meeting and recessing, the National Security Council is meeting and recessing, and I suppose, you know, these phalanxes of aides and cabinet officials and so forth wandering around, I could not miss on that one. Sold out in about 10 minutes.
You still have a copy of it?
You know, there are 3 copies of it that we're aware of. We have one, a White House maid showed us one, and I believe there's one on file in the Nixon library because I sold one to Vice President Nixon that morning. And I got a letter about 2 days later from him saying how much they had enjoyed reading it. And the Nixon girls, Mrs. Nixon, and he all agreed that I was one of their very favorite authors. So I think we've got the letter and we've got the...
Now, just to get the genealogy so everyone understands, Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, was your grandfather.
Yes.
Your father, John Eisenhower?
Yes. And
your sister is Susan Eisenhower.
That's right.
And your father and sister have been on this program before.
That's right. We have produced quite a few books from the Eisenhower family. My father is a very widely respected historian on a number of interesting topics: the Mexican-American War, World War I. His first book on his first solo effort was The Bitterwoods, which is the definitive account of the Ardennes counteroffensive. Susan has written a biography of our grandmother, Mamie. She has written a memoir of sorts, Breaking Free. She's written several books on NATO policy and things like that.
And your co-author, your wife, Julie Nixon Eisenhower?
Yes. Well, now, she is the daughter of Richard and Pat Nixon, and she is an accomplished writer. She wrote, she was actually the first, as between us, to publish a book. She published a book called Special People in 1976, and it was a long time ago. But it was that project that introduced us to the world of literary agents and publishers and started me on my long path by way of University of Pennsylvania towards publishing.
What do you do at University of Pennsylvania?
I direct the Institute for Public Service at the Annenberg School at University of Pennsylvania. That means that I run an academic concentration in the School for Communication. And so I teach and administer a program that has annually, I would say, about 15 or so majors. This is a public service concentration, which means our majors are getting ready for law school or service in Washington. Teach for America, a lot of them going to Teach for America. They become, we have some people that go into advertising and into investment banking, but I would say principally law school.
How long have you been at Penn?
I've been at Penn for a long time. I have, my first handshake was the day that President Jaruzelski of Poland imposed martial law in Poland. That's winter of 1981, I believe. There was a hiatus of about 7 years after I published Eisenhower at War, major book on the Supreme Command of World War II. I took several years out to prepare manuscripts that I will publish now over the next couple of years, including the one that we've just published. And we traveled the country speaking for about 3 years after publication of that book, and then I accepted another appointment at Penn starting in 1996, and I've been there ever since.
Now, before we get into talking about the subject matter of this book, I have to ask you about your wife. How did you two meet?
We met a couple times during the Eisenhower years. She was the daughter of the vice president. We were grandchildren of the president, and we were about the same age. And so somebody had the idea of getting us together. We met on the inaugural stand, 1957. In fact, we have a picture in this book of us being introduced. I think that's where we met. Several weeks later, the Nixon girls came over to play with my sisters, and I can remember that pretty well. I was the only guy there, and so I was special, number one, but I was not really that involved, number two. We met again at an opener, Baltimore, Washington, April of 1959. Richard Nixon threw out the first ball, and I was there to represent my grandfather, who was out of town because Fidel Castro was in town, and the president did not want to meet the Cuban president. So he absented himself, went to Augusta, and I was sent to the game. Julie and I were there together. We can establish that in pictures. Then we met in earnest as we both entered college. She entered Smith, I entered Amherst. We were about 7 miles apart, and my grandmother was aware of the fact that Julie was going to Smith, and she had met her the summer before we went off to college together, and my grandmother was bound and determined that I would call on Julie. She assured me that I would like her, and I sure did.
And you got married when?
We got married in the December of 1968, so this was about a 2-year courtship, and it began immediately.
So you would have gotten married right after President Nixon was elected? But
we were
before he
married
took
right in
office.
the interval between the election, November of 68, and his inauguration, January of 69. That was a long-standing date. We set it in early 1968. We were going into a national campaign. There was always the chance that Richard Nixon would win. There was a chance that he would lose. And we figured in either case we would do this in December. If he won, then this would be a great celebration. If he lost, then this would take the sting out of defeat. We would do it either way. I think some people suggested that we wait after he won in November, to get this done in the White House. But
You were tempted to have a White House wedding?
No, I wasn't. I really wasn't. I had been in the White House 53 to 61. I had views on the White House. We had a distant relationship with the White House throughout the 1960s. This was something that was a fairly routine conversation in our house. And I had something about doing a wedding, which is a rather personal thing, in such a public way. I just didn't want to do it. And nor did Julie.
Now, your book, first of all, the title is Going Home to Glory.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, Going Home to Glory is, this is a series of going homes. This is a book about a post-presidency, about Dwight Eisenhower beginning the day he leaves office. This is a neglected topic, I think, by historians. Historians naturally focus on presidents and the decisions they make and the preparation for the presidency. They don't look at the years out of office. And the years out of office are years in which presidents are easier to know. They're not surrounded by staff. They're not surrounded by aides. Their time is not regulated down to the second, so you can know a president in this period. Also, presidents are term limited under the 22nd Amendment. Dwight Eisenhower was the first to be formally term limited by the 22nd Amendment. What is it like for a person leaving office by operation of law and not by, I would say, natural means, either death or losing an election? This is something that we have built into our presidency, and it is something that presidents must now deal with. So we have 22nd Amendment presidencies out there. George W. Bush is one, Clinton is one, Eisenhower. How does that work? There are great books on the former president, several that I can name. Douglas Brinkley's The Unfinished Presidency, about Carter. Candace Millard's River of Doubt, about Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. I thought that for a character sketch of Dwight Eisenhower, what better way than to describe growing up as he grows old in Gettysburg. We were neighbors, and I knew him. We had a very rich correspondence, which we've drawn on here. Now, what Going Home is about is the book opens not with his inauguration, not with a great decision, not with D-Day. It opens with the Eisenhowers leaving Washington on the wintry, snow-swept January 20th, 1961, as Washington is ringing in the presidency of John Kennedy. And that is a homecoming. He goes home to Gettysburg. He goes home to other places throughout his post-presidency, because out of office, you have an opportunity to travel, to rekindle old friendships that mean something to you later in life, friendships that were necessarily sort of put on hold when he was exercising this national responsibility. And then finally, I think there's a connotation of coming to terms with the fact that he was mortal, I saw him in this period. He's looking back over his life. What regrets did he have? What satisfactions did he have? What did he expect in life? What was his philosophy? And so there is that as well.
When he left office, he could have lived anywhere in the world. Why did
Right.
he choose Gettysburg?
Well, he chose Gettysburg because they loved Gettysburg. Gettysburg was a project. The Eisenhowers lived in Pennsylvania for several centuries, or a century and a half, let's say, in the Lycans Valley, central Pennsylvania. And they left Pennsylvania for reasons I can't quite figure. I suppose I intend to do a full-length biography of Dwight Eisenhower before I'm done, which would include this part as well as the war book and the materials that we have in between and the materials that we developed prior to that. The Eisenhowers left central Pennsylvania for probably to keep their community intact. They are Mennonite types, and I think that they were restless, uncertain about the incursions of Harrisburg, which is growing, Philadelphia, which is growing westward. And so they decided to find empty land somewhere, so they went to central Kansas. That is something that did not work out very well. In central Kansas, my namesake, my great-grandfather, went bankrupt, I think, at least twice. Once in 1893 or 1891 or so, and then a second time shortly after, perhaps during the crash in 1929. When David Eisenhower lost his money, what money he had, in a swindling operation, he swindled out of a store, the Eisenhower boys were cast out. They were no longer on a farm. They were no longer looking forward to working a homestead. They had to make their way in the world the way most Americans do today. So we have an educator in this group. We have several businessmen. We have an attorney. We have a soldier. But I think in the back of Dwight Eisenhower's mind was, we've lost something. We've lost our connection with the land. We made a wrong turn somewhere, and I want to make it right. And when he had resources after the war, he wrote a very successful memoir of World War II called Crusade in Europe, which actually gave him some money. With that money, he decided to look for a homestead somewhere close to the Lycans Valley and somewhere close to Washington, and someplace that would inspire him. And one of the things that comes through in this book is, I think, my sense of what made Gettysburg, Pennsylvania such a special place. It's not just a pretty southern Pennsylvania town, and it's not just a college town. It's a town where Lincoln gave his Gettysburg Address. It's the scene of the greatest battle ever fought in North America. And these things combine to make Gettysburg feel special. So it's the combination of a special place, 200 to say 600 acres. The Greater Eisenhower Farm encompassed about 600 acres. Land, a infrastructure. They had an old farmhouse, and they had the barn set to go. And by Jove, he was going to take this land and build the farm that I think that the Eisenhower boys always dreamed of. And that's why he goes there, because he wanted to work at this in his post-presidency.
So it was an actual working farm?
Oh, yes, it was. In fact, I worked on it.
What'd you do?
I was kind of a handyman. I was given a plot of vegetables to take care of one summer. I was about 10. This is a little truck garden out behind the Mamie residence, which is an attachment to the main residence. I became a painter by 59 and 60. The white fences that mark off all the pastures at the Gettysburg Farm and the parking areas, that was one of my responsibilities. I maintained this vegetable garden. I just did odds and ends, took care of the horses.
Were you paid?
I was paid 25 cents an hour, which was big money back in 1958. And I enjoyed doing that. And as I tell in the book, at one point I finally lost interest slightly. I got a little sloppy. By 1963, I was a teenager. And I fell in with a couple of the farmhands. I relate an incident where one day we were playing cards over lunch hour, and lunch hour got a little long. We thought we were alone at the farm. I had no idea that Granddad had returned from downtown. He surprised us. He walked in on us playing cards, and I got fired right on the spot, and then rehired 2 hours later on the golf course, which meant I got my second chance. Granddad had a saying, and that was he allowed his associates one mistake a year. And I went 20 minutes over lunch hour. That was my mistake, and I learned from it. So I worked, played out the string in 1963. Then 64, by the time I turned 16 and I had wheels, I could get around. I think that I never worked on the farm again. I lived on the farm with him, and every year I had a renewable offer to return to the farm as a hand and to actually become a tutor. He wanted to learn some subjects, and so he offered me the chance to tutor him in Spanish and other things I was learning at Exeter. So I spent even more time at the farm in the following years, but not as a farmhand.
And where were you living at the time?
We lived in 1959, moving into the final year of the Eisenhower presidency. My father decided to relocate his family to our permanent home, which was right on the edge of the Gettysburg, the Eisenhower farm. The Eisenhower farm is about 189 acres. There was a little plot on the side of it, I would say about 5 acres, which had once been a schoolhouse. It was called the Pulitzer Schoolhouse. And that was remodeled into a home. We moved into it in the summer of 1959, and we were there waiting for them on January 20th, 1961, as the Eisenhowers drive north and come to dinner in our home right on the corner of the farm, and then they spend their first night outside of the White House back at their residence.
Now, did the president or the general, which did he prefer being called?
He preferred general, and he took the title general shortly after he left office. There was a bill in Congress late 1960. The outgoing Congress was considering a bill which had been put there by the Eisenhower White House, calling for his restoration to rank, 5-star general. And that slipped through the cracks somehow. Early after John Kennedy took office, the Eisenhower office in Gettysburg, Colonel Schultz asked the White House to move this bill along. This request puzzled President Kennedy. What's wrong with being Mr. President? But Eisenhower meant it, and Kennedy very graciously expedited the bill, and it passed in March 1961. He was restored to rank. Why did he prefer the title general? I think there were probably 3 considerations. One was he was a former president. Presidents, all of them, and he thought the way presidents think in terms of legacy. And by taking the title general, what I think Dwight Eisenhower was saying symbolically is that the great connection in his life, the great obligation that he had taken on, and probably the explanation for his presidency, all stems from his leadership in war and the events of 1942 through 1945, when Eisenhower had been in command of the North African campaign, the Sicily landings, and the invasion of Northwest France. In that period, a bond is formed between the leadership and the soldiers of World War II. The leadership, as best they can, are going to win the peace after we have won the war. So it served that symbolic function. It also served a practical function. As a general, he was entitled to military aids, and so his team, which Sergeant Mamie, John Mamie, his valet, was in the Army. Colonel Robert Schultz, his aide de camp, was also in the Army, and I think as a general, there was no administrative problem in keeping these people on. Third, and talking about this, this occurred to me, a general is somebody who, a 5-star general is always on duty. A former president is never on duty as a president. There is no role for a former president. Dwight Eisenhower is fashioning one in the 1960s. He's, as I say, the 22nd Amendment requires him to step down. So he goes out and he fashions a role. Former president, twice elected under the 22nd Amendment. We've had a number of people who've served in that role. Ronald Reagan did. Richard Nixon, technically, elected twice. William Clinton, George W. Bush currently, and then other presidents who've had George Herbert Walker's had quite a post-presidency, Carter and others. But as a general, he has a role. He has duties to perform. And as a general, he is consulted by Presidents Kennedy and Presidents Johnson in the 1960s on matters of national security and American defenses abroad and the struggles that we were waging, the Cold War struggles in Europe, the war in Vietnam. And he took on, in fact, in one communication, Lyndon Johnson called Dwight Eisenhower the best chief of staff I've got. In other words, Eisenhower was performing for Johnson a role not nearly as regularly, but significantly, somewhat like the one that he was playing for President Truman in 1950 and 51 when he was a general.
Was that something that was reported and generally known, or was it kind of kept on the quiet side?
I think it was kept fairly quiet. I was surprised when I...
because you had a former Republican president consulting to Democratic presidents.
Yes, well, he had also served Democrats, of course. He, by appointing him in command of Overlord, Franklin Roosevelt vested Dwight Eisenhower with probably the most confidential, the most significant appointment of any military appointment Franklin Roosevelt could make in World War II. He did not place the invasion of Northwest Europe in the hands of somebody who was not going to serve him loyally and effectively. Eisenhower had also served Truman. And he was available for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. I would say initially he did not assume a formal role in those presidencies, anything like the one that he had served in before 52, but he was in touch, and his judgment was valued. There was a lot of unfinished business after the Eisenhower years. There were crisis points in Berlin, Laos, Vietnam, Cuba, and eventually a war develops in Vietnam, and that is unfinished business from the Eisenhower years. The Vietnam situation was settled in 1954, but coming unglued by 1961, and so the Vietnam War resumes, and he takes on this role. That was not reported widely. One of the surprises that I had in going home to glory, much of it is my recollections, literally dictated in a very brief amount of time in around the clock, dictating total immersion and so forth. My recollections of that period are the heart of this book. But when we went to make it a book and to fill in the side of Dwight Eisenhower that he was a former president, he was a general, he was somebody who was a Republican leader, he was on the circuit for Republicans, he was doing all of these things, and that's what he was. When we went in to fill in that role, I was surprised by the regularity of the consultations, particularly in the Vietnam period. Starting in the summer of '65, General Goodpasture of the Army Joint Staff and Eisenhower's former NSC secretary, it had a different title then, but he'd served as NSC secretary in effect for Eisenhower. He's a regular visitor in Gettysburg, deputized by the president to brief Eisenhower regularly and to solicit his views on the unfolding war in Vietnam.
Well, you do say in the book here, when right after the assassination of John Kennedy, upon his return from Dallas, President Lyndon Baines Johnson placed a call to Eisenhower and asked him to fly to Washington for consultations. Yes. So right away in his first days in office. And you also say that Johnson phoned Eisenhower often, and Lyndon Johnson became a frequent visitor when Eisenhower checked into Walter Reed for physicals and tests. And Lyndon Johnson said, "When I need comfort, this is where I come, and this is the man I come to see."
They were personal friends. You know, this goes beyond. In fact, it's a in Eisenhower's life, I think it's a unique relationship with presidents. He served Franklin Roosevelt but did not know Franklin Roosevelt personally. He had been drawn into Roosevelt's service in the winter of 1942 while serving at war plans in Washington. He was an assistant to George Marshall. As an assistant to Marshall, he was in fairly frequent contact with the president, which is how Franklin Roosevelt developed such a high regard for Eisenhower. But that was a strictly professional relationship. I think there was a friendship with Harry Truman. The Eisenhower diaries make that pretty clear that in 49, 50, and 51, Ike liked Harry Truman and sympathized with Truman. I think he was thrilled by Truman's decisiveness and so on, but he identified with Truman as a fellow Midwesterner and was very fond of him. Now, that was not what I would call a friendship as such. I don't think that they socialized at all. Of course, his relations with John Kennedy are going to be very correct. John Kennedy campaigned in 1960 against the errors and the shortcomings of the Eisenhower presidency, and these things are felt. And so there was a distance between them, but they warmed as the Kennedy administration went on. But Kennedy drew Eisenhower in to consult on things like arms control with the Russians. In the summer of '63, Kennedy submitted a test ban treaty, needed Eisenhower's support to get Republican support in the Congress behind that treaty, civil rights. Summer of '63, NATO diplomacy in late '62, the Cuban Missile Crisis '62, they had a working professional relationship. Now when Johnson comes to office, this is a completely different relationship. Eisenhower had known Johnson as Majority Leader of the Senate. At one time, it had been President Eisenhower and Senator Johnson. In '65, it's President Johnson and General Eisenhower. So they had actually changed places. Eisenhower had known Johnson as sort of a well-meaning opposition figure, but a subordinate. Now Johnson knew Eisenhower in the same capacity. There was a parity there, number one. Number two, they had remarkably similar backgrounds. If you go to the Johnson Ranch in the hill country of Texas and look at a map and ask yourself, where am I? And then examine the building. I am overwhelmed by the similarities between the so-called Johnson Ranch house and the Eisenhower farm residence in Gettysburg. It's as though they shared architects, the same building, built at the same time. They both wanted to be ranchers, farmers. If you look at Johnson City, Texas, it's surrounded by German settlers. Like Gettysburg, it's a huge German enclave in central Texas. I think Johnson probably has English ancestry, but he's surrounded by all these Germans. Dwight Eisenhower was born in Texas. They had a similar kind of sense of humor. They had many shared associates, and they liked each other. And so that was a friendship. And Johnson, things got very difficult for President Johnson from '65 on. And Dwight Eisenhower lent, I think, assurance. Eisenhower was a figure that Johnson respected a great deal. And the ability to share concerns and to hear the former president, the former Supreme Commander, understand things, perhaps not always agree with what Johnson is doing, but to understand things in the way Johnson wanted to be understood must have been a source of assurance and comfort for President Johnson.
So he did not have that kind of relationship with John Kennedy?
No, he couldn't. Now, whether it would have developed had Dallas not intervened, I don't think so. I think John Kennedy is, there is such a contrast between the two. Kennedy is the youngest elected president ever. Eisenhower is the oldest serving when he retired. Ronald Reagan exceeded that by a good margin, but I think there was a regard there. There was a interesting, brief but interesting correspondence over the years. They first met in 1945. Kennedy was a reporter and interviewed General Eisenhower in the IG Farben complex in Frankfurt, as I understand it. Kennedy was on some sort of assignment. He went to Moscow, he went to Berlin in the immediate aftermath of VE Day. Kennedy was elected to the Senate, and Eisenhower had to notice that because Kennedy defeated Henry Cabot Lodge, who was Eisenhower's campaign chairman. Defeated Lodge and had health problems. Dwight Eisenhower was very solicitous on Kennedy's behalf when he had a back operation, or he had a serious back problem and serious health problems in the mid-1950s. Politics divides. Friendships really don't survive national campaigns. Nixon and Kennedy had actually been friends, good friends. In fact, their offices were right next to each other in the one of the Senate office buildings, and they were quite friendly until the 60 campaign. 60 campaign, Kennedy wages a campaign to restore the Democratic Party to power. They are critical of the Republicans, view the Republicans as an anomaly. What I noticed they are able to do is they were able to compartmentalize. Eisenhower and Kennedy met. In fact, one of the things I relate in Going Home to Glory, my grandfather took my sister and I on a long trip to Europe in the summer of 1962. When he got back, he was called to the White House to brief Kennedy on this trip. The White House made a recording of their conversation, which the Kennedy Library shared with me. He's briefing Kennedy on the very trip that I had been on, and they were very cordial. All right, so this is statesman Dwight Eisenhower briefing President Kennedy on his conversations with Adenauer, de Gaulle, his views on the current state of the Berlin crisis, prospects in Europe, and so forth. Friends. Well, cordial. 5 days later, John Kennedy is giving a speech in Harrisburg, I think, where he's criticizing Eisenhower foreign policy, which Eisenhower had sort of understood he would not do. Eisenhower retaliates about 3 weeks later with a speech denouncing Kennedy foreign policy in Boston. Through intermediaries, they sort of agree not to criticize each other on foreign policy anymore. They remain opponents, domestic policy opponents. All the while, Kennedy is extending all of these wonderful courtesies to Dwight Eisenhower, sending him golf balls, presidential golf balls, and pleasant notes, and vice versa. So they compartmentalized. There was an area where Eisenhower could cooperate with Kennedy, where he could deliver Republican support for key Kennedy programs such as civil rights, test ban. And then there was this side where they were opponents.
Well, the 1964 election came along, and Dwight Eisenhower, the immediate past president, was his apparent good friend Lyndon Johnson was running for a full term. What role did Dwight Eisenhower have in the Republican Party for that year?
Well, what happens in the narrative of Going Home to Glory is that Johnson disappears for a while. After they meet during the Kennedy funeral, I know firsthand that they had fairly steady contact throughout 1964, and they were friends. In fact, I was aboard a helicopter with helicopters. Yeah, I believe it was a helicopter provided by Lyndon Johnson on the day of the Gulf of Tonkin, the second Gulf of Tonkin incident, because there was a teletype, and I can remember my grandfather looking it over, and he was in steady touch with Johnson on these seminal events in the Vietnam conflict. But I don't know if they were in touch with each other. They were very discreet in '64. What's happening in '64 is that Johnson is going to seek election in his own right, and the Republican Party wakes up in early 1964 to realize that the party has been transformed without anybody really having noticed it. Suddenly there's a whole cadre of what today you would call conservative activists who have been mobilized by the Goldwater campaign, and the odds are they are going to drive their nominee to nomination in San Francisco. This took Eisenhower and the so-called Eastern wing of the Republican Party by surprise. I don't think they woke up to this until I would say around the New Hampshire primary, And then they realized that Goldwater had out-organized everybody, and that's what he did. Goldwater out-organized his potential rivals in 1964. Goldwater was never, according to any poll I've ever seen, not for an hour, the choice of rank-and-file Republicans for the 1964 nomination. He was always distinctly third or fourth. The leading fellow through most of the spring was Henry Cabot Lodge. Then Nixon for a while was the choice of rank-and-file. So it was Nixon Lodge. The 1960 ticket were actually favored by most Republicans. But Goldwater organized a determined group within the Republican Party and changed the face of the Republican Party, giving him his due. He definitely changed the direction of the Republican Party from 64 on. Eisenhower resisted this, not because he wasn't conservative. And Dwight Eisenhower was a very conservative man. I think that comes through, even more conservative in many ways than Ronald Reagan. But number one, he believed in moderation, which is a style of government. It doesn't refer to a program, it's a style. It's sort of recognizing that politics is about compromise, making friends across the aisle, being for your side, but being friendly towards all. It refers to a style. He was a moderate. And he also had a specific point of disagreement with Barry Goldwater, and that was over the appropriateness of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Goldwater had well-founded, or I would say well-considered, not founded, well-considered constitutional objections to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He voted against the act. And Eisenhower, who had laid the foundations for the civil rights of the 1960s, as in his second term as president, was very clear that civil rights probably required bipartisanship, and he wanted the Republican Party on record as being for it. This is the party of Lincoln. So they differed over that. And so Eisenhower sponsored alternatives, and it didn't work.
Did Dwight Eisenhower support a particular Republican candidate in the primaries?
Well, I think without question, he supported Scranton. Now, he did not support Scranton the way Scranton needed to be supported, which would have been open support backed by even barnstorming and doing whatever he could. Eisenhower did not. I think that Granddad probably felt that it would not work. When the Scranton bandwagon started, this was in response to several Goldwater votes, procedural votes on civil rights, where Goldwater made it clear he was going to oppose the 64 Civil Rights Act. When that became clear, Bill Scranton emerged as a formal candidate. By then, I'm pretty sure that a head count of delegates would have shown that Goldwater was the nominee of the party. Eisenhower wanted to support Scranton, but to have supported him in knowledge that Goldwater was the nominee of the party, it would have been a symbolic gesture, and it would have done all kinds of other factors into the equation here. Goldwater is not Eisenhower's choice, but Eisenhower had not been the choice of conservatives in 1952 either.
Did he campaign? Did Eisenhower campaign for Goldwater in '64?
Sort of. Yeah, he made several speeches. He made for Senate candidates, and of course Goldwater's on the ballot. He hosted several unity meetings and made statements on Goldwater's behalf. He hosted a television conversation with Barry Goldwater that was filmed in, I think, October of '64 to rebut this idea that Goldwater was trigger happy, and did several things like that. But he was not enlisted in the campaign. A former president wouldn't necessarily be enlisted in a campaign, but he was definitely not enlisted in '64.
What did you call Dwight Eisenhower?
I called him Granddad, and that's the way he signs his letters to me.
How often did he write to you?
In the book, he wrote fairly regularly. I would say every 2 or 3 weeks. We could actually check that. And I have a number of the letters. I think I've probably lost several, but I kept them, and we unearthed them some years ago And I was awfully grateful to have those letters. Without going to the Eisenhower Library and seeing his end of the correspondence, we developed this section of the book. I was unusual in our small little family. We lived as a small family unit. Ike and Mamie, my mother and father, and the four of us lived at the farm. And what made me different is that I went away to school. And because I went away to school, I had a correspondence with my grandparents, I had a correspondence with my father and mother and things like that. And so I have this correspondence. He signed his letters Granddad. And so I think that's what I called him most of the time.
Was the family kind of disappointed that you didn't go to West Point?
Yes. As it turns out, I was being primed for West Point. I didn't recognize that. I thought I was being pushed away from West Point. My father made it a point to give me a choice, that's the way he put it. And another way he put it is that he felt he had not exactly had a choice. I don't know about that. I've seen letters between my father and his father in the 1940-41 period, and Dad sounds pretty dedicated to the idea of West Point. But in any case, my father took a position that I'm very grateful for. It's really made all the difference in my life, and that is that his son would have a choice. And so I got sent to Phillips Exeter Academy.
At what age?
14. That's about as civilian an institution as exists. It did not occur to me to apply to West Point. It did not occur to me. We did have one fellow who went to West Point from Exeter, but I didn't know him. He lived on the other side of campus, and it just simply didn't occur to me to go. And then I arrive at Amherst, and one of the first letters from Granddad that I got at Amherst, addressed to me at Pratt Hall, he acknowledged that he had hoped that I would go to West Point. I was conscious at a certain age that I was being given the opportunity. I had flat feet, or had pretty flat feet, and I was put on sort of a regimen where you exercise the two big toes and so forth in such a way as to build up arches.
You tell that in the book about
Yeah,
marbles.
tell us. And you know, when you're in summertime, you're in a swimming pool, and you leave footprints when you're running around. You've been in the water, and you get out and you leave footprints. One of the things I always noticed from an early age were, I would say, ideal footprints. Ones with high arches, have sort of a curve. And so I would work on that, so that my footprints would have the same curve. And I think I developed it. I haven't really had trouble with my feet, and I was no problem for the United States Navy when that time came.
Oh, you were in the Navy?
I was in the Navy, yes.
For how long?
Almost 3 years. I went through Naval OCS at Newport and graduated in March of '71, and spent from there on. I was officially in the Navy when I arrived at Newport, commissioned an officer on a 3-year stint. And I served 2 of those years, and then the USS Albany came here to Philadelphia for a year in the Yard, and they more or less offered the reserve naval officers an opportunity to apply for early outs if they wanted one, and I felt sure, so I applied for an early out and I was granted one.
What was Dwight Eisenhower like around the dinner table?
You know, it's funny, I don't remember saying a lot at dinner tables, so I remember listening a lot. As Going Home to Glory unfolds, this remote figure becomes much closer. I became, in the summer of '64, my parents had moved to Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, which is close to here, away from Gettysburg. I spent that summer living with my grandparents. We had lunch regularly, the 3 of us, and dinner, or the 2 of us, and dinner on trays on the sun porch, or occasionally in the main dining room at the Gettysburg farm. And I probably was more involved then, probably reporting on my day. How's your day? How are things? You know, what are you planning to do? This, that, and so on. What I remember best about dinner and social hours around my grandparents was watching the interaction between them and the usual guests who were around. There were a lot of guests. They were very social. And I was fascinated by it. I developed, I think, at an early age, and this is something that has influenced me professionally, a sense of what leaders are, of what decision makers are, what kind of personalities they are, how they relax, how they go to work, this and that. This is sort of second nature to me, and it's just something I've carried over into the study of recent American history and the teaching I do at University of Pennsylvania, the study of speeches and how people communicate, and so on. It was a seminar on this for years, and I loved it. It was a very dignified. Our social hours are very, very dignified and high level.
If you lived in Gettysburg at the time, might you have seen the Eisenhowers going into the grocery store or getting a haircut or something like that?
Well, I think so, particularly my grandmother. My grandmother was a real presence in Gettysburg. She enjoyed, but my grandfather liked to get out. He had a office right in the downtown area on the campus of Gettysburg College. In fact, there's a statue of him outside the building where the Eisenhower offices were. He was not Harry Truman. He did not walk to work. So he was not somebody that was saying good morning to the neighbors as he was going to the office. But the Eisenhower team was there, and they made good friends, very good friends in the Gettysburg area. The Scharfs, who ran the Gettysburg Hotel, the McCaskells, Reverend McCaskill I covered, the Johnsons, who were doctors, and other people. And it was a warm, lovely era in my mind, secure, purposeful, pleasant.
When he was not engaged in public policy, how did he spend his time?
He's one of the best relaxers, or one of the best, I would say. His motto was, if you haven't had fun in a day, you've wasted a day. And I don't think anybody was better at having fun while carrying extraordinary weight of decision, responsibility, than Dwight Eisenhower. He did everything all out, and that is running a farm. It was playing golf. It was skeet shooting and hunting. It was playing bridge.
You say in the book that he was a pretty ferocious bridge player.
He's a ferocious bridge player. He was the one thing that I would say, and I loved recreating it in the book. The one activity where I felt that he was in a completely different state of mind. It became, in fact, I can still see a sort of beatific smile on his face as he's sitting there dabbing paints. He loved to paint, and now painting, like everything else, was a social activity. His paint easel is set up at a strategic spot on the sun porch so that he has guests over here and Mamie's over here and so forth, and so he can sit in the middle and sort of talk. When he had a studio in the White House, as a boy, I was very often sort of called in to sit for a chat, and he was often accompanied as he was painting. But he seemed to wander into a different state when he was painting. I think that was the one contemplative thing that he did. Otherwise, it was he loved the action, and he loved having fun. Cooking, he was a great cook, and cooking great meals was a huge production. There were certain dishes that he would do would take 2-3 days to complete. Certain kinds of soups and other things that he would make. So he had a lot of zest for doing things, and he was, as you say, a ferocious bridge player. He's a terrific competitor on a golf course, and so on and so on. The one thing that was not a competitive activity, again, was the painting. And probably the best description I got of it was from General Walter DeKosh, who had been the assistant physician during the 1950s, and to peruse the guest book at Gettysburg. He was a pretty frequent visitor at Gettysburg, and I thought that Walter's description of Dwight Eisenhower painting was probably better than the one that I could have come up with on my own, but it was similar and it resonated. I had many experiences like that with my grandfather.
Do you have any of his paintings?
We have, I would say 4 or 5. We have, they are all over the place. A lot of people have Eisenhower paintings. A lot of them are gone. He threw away a lot of paintings. Sergeant Money saved some of the ones that he threw away. So probably the Monies have quite a few.
We only have a few minutes left. What I gather from your book is you were in the room at Walter Reed Hospital when Dwight Eisenhower died?
Yes, I was.
Describe that.
Well, it was my first experience with something like this.
How long had he been in the hospital?
Well, he'd been in the hospital. He was admitted at Walter Reed, I think, in May of '68. That would have been end of May, because he had to recuperate. He had a massive heart attack in California in late April, and he spent several weeks recuperating at March Field Air Force Base before he was able to be moved. He was moved to Walter Reed and then moves into the so-called Ward 8 suite, which is at the Walter Reed Army Hospital. And this part of his life, which is the last 10 months, is probably why I did this book. And I think it's why doing this book occurred to me, because I'm on the verge of becoming 21. I'm just about to be married. I'm involved in a campaign, and in fact, they're actually scheduling us into places on this campaign where Julie and I are responsible for events. We are being thrust out there. I am moving through college. I'm approaching decisions about what to do after college. I'm sort of grown up. And he's at the very end of his life. And it must have been obvious to him, as it was obvious to us all, that he was really at the end. His world had become Ward 8. And I visited him as often as I could, and I just absorbed everything. I just, the way I sort of analogize it is that it's like layers being stripped away to see sort of an inner core. The bravery and the serenity of that man in those circumstances overwhelmed me. And I knew that I wanted to do a story about him. And over time, that story takes on features. He's a former president. He's a general. He's consulting presidents. He's operating under the 22nd Amendment. He's running a farm. All these things are part of the story. But the reason I did the story is because I'll just never get over my exposure to the man. And yes, I was in the room. My father and I were there, and I still have a very vivid mental picture of it. It was a separation from a person that meant so much to me.
Well, I wish we could spend more time talking about it, but if people want to know the full story, they will have to read the book. This is the cover of it, Going Home to Glory, and it is by David Eisenhower and Julie Nixon Eisenhower. And before we finish, I have to say that Camp David,
yes,
you're David.
Yeah, I'm David, yeah. That's right. His father, Dwight Eisenhower's father, was also David. So we share credit in the official histories, but when the Eisenhowers moved into the White House in 1953, there were 3 or 4 installations that belonged to the Executive Office of the President provided by the United States Navy. One was Camp Shangri-La. That got named for me because I'm senior. The second was the presidential yacht. That got named for Barbara Ann, my oldest sister. Then there was another little yacht, and that got named the Susan Elaine, and that's the person that you interviewed on this show. And then finally a little tugboat came along, and Mary was born, and we had a little Mary E. So this was in order of seniority in our household, and I got the camp, and by pure historical accident, the camp became an historic site. And it seems to be every president has the right to rename it. President Obama can call it Camp Michelle if he wishes, and I would be happy with that. And I think I've had a very good run. But somehow it seems to be historical, and people don't think they act as though it can't be renamed. It can be.
Well, we have been speaking with David Eisenhower. He is the co-author with his wife, Julie Nixon Eisenhower, of this book, Going Home to Glory, and it is the years with Dwight Eisenhower, 1961 to 1969. Thank you very much.
Brian, thanks for having me.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNtv.com or the App Store for details. Like us on Facebook.